Let me go get some light. Okay, so I'm gonna wait till we get more people here. Uh, Today I'm gonna be reading uh Percy Jackson and the Olympians, The Lightning Thief. Uh, I accidentally vaporized my pre-algebra teacher. Look, I didn't want to be a half-blood. If you're reading this because you think you might be one, my advice is close this book right now. Believe whatever lie your mom or dad told you about your birth, and try leading a normal life. Being a half blood is dangerous. It's scary. Most of the time, you get killed in painful, nasty ways. If you're a normal kid reading this because you think it's fiction, great, read on. I envy you for being able to believe that none of this ever happened. But if you recognize yourself in these pages, you feel something stirring up inside, stop reading immediately. You might be one of us. And once you know that, it's only a matter of time before they sense it too. And they'll come for you. Don't say I didn't warn you. My name is Percy Jackson. I'm 12 years old. Until a few months ago, I was a boarding student at Yancey Academy, a private school for troubled kids in upstate New York. Am I a troubled kid? Yeah, you can say that. I could start at any point in my short, miserable life to prove it. But things really started going bad last May when our sixth grade class took a field trip to Manhattan with 28 mental case kids and two teachers on a yellow bus heading to the Metropolitan Museum of Art to look at ancient Greek and Roman stuff. I know, it sounds like torture. Most Yancey field trips were. But Mr. Brunner, our Latin teacher, was leading this trip, so I had hopes. Mr. Brunner was this middle-aged guy in a motorized wheelchair. He had thinning hair and a scruffy beard and a frayed tweed jacket, which always smelled like coffee. You wouldn't think he'd be cool, but he told stories and jokes and let us play weapons. So he was the only teacher whose class didn't put me to sleep. Boy, was I wrong. Wait, no. I hoped the trip would be okay. At least I hoped for once I wouldn't get into trouble. Boy, was I wrong. See, bad things happen to me on field trips. Like at my fifth grade school, we went to Saratoga Battlefield. I had this accident with a Revolutionary War cannon. I wasn't aiming for the school bus, but of course I got expelled anyway. And before that, my fourth grade school, when we took at a behind the scenes tour of the Marine World Shark Pool, I sort of hit the rung lever at the catwalk, and our class took an unplanned swim. And time before that, I get the idea. This trip, I was determined to be good. All the way into the city, I put up with Nancy Bobofet, a freckly, red-headed kleptomaniac girl, hitting my best friend Grover in the back of the head with chunks of peanut butter and ketchup sandwich. Grover was an easy target. He was scrawny, he cried when he got frustrated, he must have been held back several grades because he was the only sixth grader with acne and the start of a wispy beard on his chin. On top of all that, he was crippled. He had a note excusing him from PE for the rest of his life because he had some kind of muscular disease in his legs. He walked funny. Every step hurt him. But don't let that fool you. You should have seen him run when it was enchilada day in the cafeteria. Anyway, Nancy Bobofet was throwing wads of sandwich that stuck in his curly hair, and she knew I couldn't do anything about it because I was already on probation. The headmaster had threatened me with death by in-school suspension if anything bad, embarrassing, or even mildly entertaining happened on this trip. I'm going to kill her, I mumbled. Grover tried to calm me down. It's okay. I like peanut butter. He dodged another piece of Nancy's lunch. That's it. I started to get up, but Grover pulled me back to my seat. You're already on probation, he reminded me. You know who will get blamed if anything happens. Looking back on it, I wish I'd decked Nancy Bobofet right then and there. In-school suspension would have been nothing compared to the mess I was about to get myself into. Mr. Brunner led the museum tour. He rode up in front of his wheelchair, guiding us through the big echoey galleries, past the marble statues and glass cases of really old black and orange pottery. It blew my mind that this stuff had survived for 2,000, 3,000 years. He gathered around a 13-foot tall stone column with a big sphinx on top and started telling us that how it was a grave marker, a steal for a girl about our age. He told us about the carvings on the side. I was trying to listen to what he had to say because it was kind of interesting, but everybody around me was talking, and every time I told them to shut up, the other chaperone, Mrs. Dodds, gave me an evil laugh. Miss Dodds was this little math teacher from Georgia who always wore a black leather jacket even though she was 50 years old. She looked mean enough to ride a Harley right into your locker. She had come to Nancy halfway through the year when our last math teacher had a nervous breakdown. From the first day, Miss Dodds loved Nancy Bobofet and figured I was the devil spawn. She would always point her crooked finger at me and say, "Now, honey," in a real sweet. And I knew I was going to get after school detention for a month. One time, after she'd made me erase answers out of math workbooks until midnight, I told Grover I didn't think Mrs. Dodds was human. He looked at me, real serious, and said, "You're absolutely right." Mr. Brunner kept Mr. Brunner kept talking about the Greek funeral art. Finally, Nancy snickered about something the naked guy on the steel, and I turned around and said, "Will you shut up?" It came out louder than I meant to. The whole group laughed, and Mr. Brunner stopped his story. "Mr. Jackson," he said, "do you have a comment?" My face was totally red. I said, No, sir. Mr. Brunner pointed to one of the statues, to one of the pictures on the steel. Perhaps you'll tell us what this picture represents. I looked at the carving and I felt a flush of relief because I actually recognized it. That's Kronos eating his kids, right? Yes, Mr. Brunner said, obviously not satisfied. And he did this because, well, I racked my brain to remember. Kronos was the king god, and God? Mr. Brunner asked. Titan! I corrected myself, and he didn't trust his kids, who were the gods, so Kronos ate him, right? But his wife hid baby Zeus in a rock and gave Kronos a rock to eat instead. Later on, when Zeus grew up, he tricked his dad, Kronos, into barfing up his brothers and sisters. Ew. One of the girls from behind me said. And so there was a big fight between the gods and titans, I continued. And the gods won. Some snickers from behind the group. Behind me, Nancy Bobafett mumbled to a friend, like we're going to use this stuff in real life, like we're going to say this in our job applications. Please explain why Kronos ate his kids. And why, Mr. Jackson, Werner said, to paraphrase Mrs. Bobafett's excellent question, does this matter in real life? Busted! Grover muttered. Shut up. Nancy hissed, her face brighter, even brighter than her red hair. At least Nancy got packed, too. Mr. Brunner was the only one who ever caught her saying anything wrong. He had radar ears. I thought about his question and shrugged. I don't know, sir. I see. Mr. Brunner looked disappointed. Well, half credit, Mr. Jackson. Zeus did indeed feed Proteus a mixture of mustard and wine, which made him disgorge his other 5 children, who, of course, being immortal gods, had been living and growing up completely undigested in the Titan's stomach. The gods defeated their father, sliced him into pieces with his own scythe, and scattered his remains in Tartarus, the darkest pit of the underworld. On that happy note, it's time for lunch. Mrs. Dodds, would you lead them back outside? The class drifted off, girls holding their stomachs and guys pushing each other around and acting like doofuses. Grover and I were about to follow when Mr. Brunner said, Mr. Jackson, I knew what was coming. I told Grover to keep going, and then I turned toward Mr. Brunner. Sir? Mr. Brunner had this look that wouldn't let you go. Intense brown eyes that could have been 1,000 years old and had seen everything. You must learn the answer to my question, Mr. Brunner told me. About the Titans? About real life, and how your studies apply to it. Oh, what you learn from me, he said, is vitally important. I expect you to treat it as such. I will only accept the best from you, Percy Jackson. I wanted to get angry. This guy pushed me so hard. I mean, sure, he was kind of cool on tournament days when he dressed up in a suit of Roman armor and shouted, What ho! And challenged us, sword point against chalk to run the board every time, and name every Greek and Roman person who ever lived and their mother and what god they worshipped. But Mr. Brunner expected me to be as good as everybody else, despite the fact that I have dyslexia and attention deficient disorder. And I have never made above a C minus in my life. No, he didn't expect me to be as good. He expected me to be better. At least I couldn't learn all those names and facts, much less spell them correctly. I mumbled something about trying harder, while Mr. Brunner took one long, sad face at the steel like he'd been at this girl's funeral. Told me to go outside and eat my lunch. The classes gathered on the front porch of the museum where he could watch the foot traffic along Fifth Avenue. Overhead, a huge storm was brewing, clouds blacker than I'd ever seen over the sky. Maybe it was global warming or something, because weather all across New York State had been weird since Christmas. We'd had massive snowstorms, flooding, wildfires from lightning strikes. It wouldn't have been surprising if this was a hurricane blowing in. Nobody else seemed to notice. Some of the guys were pelting pigeons with Lunchables crackers. Nancy Bobafett was trying to pickpocket something from a lady's purse. And of course, Mrs. Dodds wasn't seeing a thing. Grover and I sat on the edge of the fountain, everyone away from the others. We thought that maybe if we did that, everybody wouldn't know we were from that school for loser freaks who didn't make it elsewhere. Detention? Grover asked. Nah, I said. Not Mr. Brenner. I just wish he'd lay off on me sometimes. I mean, not a genius. Grover didn't say anything for a while. Then, when I thought he was going to give me a deep philosophical comment to make me feel better, he said, "Can I have your apple?" I didn't have much of an appetite, so I let it take him. I watched the stream of cabs go down Fifth Avenue and then thought about my mom's apartment, only a little ways uptown from where we sat. I hadn't seen her since Christmas. I wanted to so bad to jump in a taxi and head home. She'd hug me and be glad to see me, but she'd be disappointed too. She'd send me right back to Yancey Academy. Remind me that I should had to try harder, even if this was my sixth year in this was my sixth school in 6 years, and I was probably going to be kicked out again. I wouldn't be able to stand that sad look she'd give me. Mr. Brunner parked his wheelchair at the base of the handicapped ramp. He ate celery while he read the paperback novel. A red umbrella stuck up from the back of his chair, making it so making it look like a motorized coffee table. I was about to unwrap my sandwich when Nancy Bobofet appeared in front of me with her ugly friends. I guess she'd gotten tired of stealing from the tourists and dumped her half-eaten lunch in Grover's lap. Oops. She grinned at me with her crooked teeth. Her freckles were orange, as if someone had spray painted her with liquid Cheetos. I tried to stay cool. The counselor had told me a million times, count to 10, get control of your temper. But I was mad. My mind went blank. A wave roared in my ears. I don't remember touching her, but the next thing I knew, Nancy was in a fountain, sitting on her butt in the fountain, screaming, Percy pushed me. Mrs. Dodds materialized next to us. Some of the kids were whispering, Did you see the water? Like it grabbed her. I didn't know what they were talking about. All I knew was I was in trouble again. As soon as Miss Dodds was sure poor little Nancy was okay, promising to get her a new shirt at the museum gift shop, etc., etc., Mrs. Dodds turned to me. There was a triumphant fire in her eyes, as if I'd done something she'd been waiting for all semester. Now, honey. I know, I grumbled. A month of erasing workbooks. That wasn't the right thing to say. Come with me, Mrs. Dodd said. Wait, Grover yelped. It was me. I pushed her. I stared at him, stunned. I couldn't believe he was trying to cover for me. Mrs. Dodd scared Grover to death. I glared at him so hard his whiskery chin trembled. I don't think so, Mr. Underwood, he said. But you will stay here. Grover looked at me desperately. It's okay, man, I told him. Thanks for trying. Honey, Mrs. Dodds barked at me. Now. Nancy Bobofet smirked. I gave her my deluxe I will kill you later stare. Then I turned my face to Mrs. Dodds, but she wasn't there. She was standing at the top of the museum entrance, on the way on all the way at the top steps, impatiently waiting for me to come. I could get there so fast. I have moments like that a lot, when my brain falls asleep or something, and the next thing I know, I've missed something, as if a puzzle piece had fell out of the universe and left me staring at a blank space behind it. The school counselor told me that was part of my ADHD, my brain misinterpreting things. I wasn't so sure. I went after Mrs. Dodds halfway up the steps. I glanced back at Grover. He was looking pale, cutting his eyes between me and Mr. Brenner, like he wanted Mr. Brenner to notice what was going on. But Mr. Brenner was absorbed in his novel. I looked back up. Mrs. Dodds had disappeared again. Now she was inside the building, at the end of the entrance hall. Okay, I thought. She's going to make me buy a new shirt for Nancy at the gift shop. Apparently that wasn't the plan. I followed her deep into the museum, and I finally caught up to her. We were back in the Greek and Roman section. Except for us, the gallery was empty. Mrs. Dodds stood with her arms crossed in front of a big marble frieze of the Greek gods. She was making this weird noise with her throat, like growling. Even at the end, even without the noise, I would have been nervous. It's weird being alone with a teacher, especially Mrs. Dodds. Something about the way she looked at the frieze, as if she wanted to pulverize it. You've been giving us problems, honey, she said. I did the same thing and said, Yes, ma'am. She tugged on the cuffs of her leather jacket. Did you really think you would get away with it? The look in her eyes was beyond mad. It was evil. She's a teacher, I thought nervously. It's not like she's going to hurt me. I said, I'll try harder, ma'am. Thunder shook the building. They're not fools, Percy Jackson, Mrs. Dodd said. It's only a matter of time before we found you out. Confess, and you'll suffer less pain. I didn't know what she was talking about. All I could think of was that the teachers must have found my illegal stash of candy I've been selling out of my dorm room. Or maybe they realized I got my essay off Tom Sawyer from the internet without ever reading the book, and now they were going to take away my grade. Or worse, they were going to make me read the book. Well, she demanded. Ma'am, I don't. Your time is up, she hissed. Then the weirdest thing happened. Her eyes began to glow like barbecue coals. Her fingers stretched, turning into talons. Her jacket melted into a large, leathery wings. She wasn't human. She shriveled, she was a shriveled hag with bat wings, claws, and a mouth full of yellow fangs. And she was about to slice me to ribbon. And things got even stranger. Mr. Brunner, who'd been out in front of the museum a minute before, wheeled a chair in the doorway of the gallery, holding a pen out. What ho, Percy! He yelled, tossed the pen. Miss Scott lunged at me. With a yelp, I dodged and felt the talon slash the air next to my ear. I snatched the ballpoint pen out of the air. When it hit my head, it wasn't a pen anymore. It was a sword. Mr. Brunner's bronze sword, which he always used on tournament day. Mrs. Dodd spun around and gave me a murderous look in her eyes. Her knees were jelly. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the sword. She snarled, Die, honey. She flew straight at me. Absolute terror ran through my body. I did the only thing I can naturally. I swung the sword. The metal blade hit her shoulder and passed clean through her body, as if she were made of water. Mrs. Dodd was a sand castle with a power fan. She exploded into yellow powder, vaporized on the spot, leaving nothing but the smell of sulfur and a dying screech with a chill of evil in the air, as if two glowing red eyes were still watching me. I was alone. There was a ballpoint pen in my hand. Mr. Brunner wasn't there. Nobody was there but me. My hands were trembling. My lunch must have been contaminated with magic mushrooms or something. Had I imagined the whole thing? I went back outside. It had started to rain. Grover was sitting by the fountain, a museum map tented over his head. Nancy Bobofet was still standing there, soaked from her swim in the fountain. Grumbling at her ugly friends, when she saw me, she said, I hope Mrs. Kerr whipped your butt. I said, who? Our teacher? Duh. I blinked. We had no teacher named Mrs. Kerr. I asked Nancy what she was talking about. She just rolled her eyes and turned away, and I asked Grover where Mrs. Dodds was. He said, who? He paused at first, and then he didn't look at me, so I thought he was messing with me. Oh, funny man, I told him this is serious. Thunder boomed overhead. I saw Mr. Brunner sitting under his red umbrella, reading his book as if he'd never noticed me. I went over to him. He looked up, a little distracted. Ah, that would be my pen. Please bring your own writing utensil in the future, Mr. Jackson. Mr. Brunner's pen. I hadn't even realized I was still holding it. Sir? I said, where's Mrs. Dodds? He stared at me blankly. Who? The other chaperone, Mrs. Dodds, the pre-algebra teacher. He frowned and sat forward, looking mildly concerned. Percy, there's no Mrs. Dodds in this trip. As far as I know, there never have been any Mrs. Dodds at Nancy Academy. Are you feeling all right? End of chapter 1. Like, subscribe, be good people.